Okay.
So one was a good hitter.
All right.
I guess it's up to you to decide.
So,
Which one was
first
the
things,
good hitter?
second data.
Fighting words.
So data, for some reason this is not very well in focus, but it's clear enough. So let me just talk a little bit about the numerical scores and then the content and the usual little bit post-mortem. So total possible 40 points, divided like so. Look on the right side there, the median is 30, 75%. Good. For me, that's usually an indication of a test that I feel is well pitched. And so in that sense, be happy. And then the breakdown by 3 problems you see here. Roughly what I would say I expected. I have a particular comment on the third problem in just a moment. In terms of the distribution, this was a little bit different than I expected. While the median/mean are about where I kind of hoped for, it's a broader distribution than I would maybe have expected, which has implications both at the left side and the right side. On the right side, a good number of people did very well. But a good number of people scored 40 points. That's great. Obviously, that's good. It's actually more people clustered at the right side than I might have expected, so that's good. On the left side, a few people who was challenging for. So the usual comments there, and before I talk about the specific content, if you are feeling it didn't go well, as always, now's the time to come talk to me, sort of see what we can do to get you back to where you want to be for the final. Of course, as you knew ahead of time, this was a more challenging exam, the material is more conceptual, it's a little harder to make the transition from understanding concepts to applying those concepts in problems. So it's not unusual for a second midterm in this course to be challenging. So for those of you who found that, don't think that's unusual. It's true for everyone. So that's some sort of general comments. Again, if you feel like you want to take some corrective actions, talk to me as soon as possible. You don't want to be waiting until the week before finals to try and kind of bounce back. So let's talk soon and come up with a strategy to finish strong. In terms of the specific content of the 3 problems, so on the first one, generally good. A few of you made your lives unnecessarily difficult by wanting to figure out the electric field associated with that charge distribution and then use that to determine the potential. Now, in principle, that can be done, but it's not so straightforward for this geometry. And some of you who did that realized along the way or immediately afterwards that you needn't have taken the time or the effort, if you will, to figure out the electric field, but you could simply do a integral summation over the potential for the entire distribution, which makes the problem way, way, way simpler. So, I don't know that I have any particular recommendations there other than, and this topic of electromagnetism has the benefit of when you get to the end of the semester and look back, it will make more sense as a whole than it does as we're going along. That doesn't help you at the midterm point, but it will, you'll get a much sort of more coherent big picture look back on things as we approach the end of the semester. And at that point, I'm hoping that you all have a better feel for what's the fastest or most efficient tool to solve a particular problem. That is the hardest skill to learn in a course like this. It comes primarily from practice, repeated exposure, and again, it gets better when you see the big picture with hindsight. So in that sense, I don't have any particular recommendation for sort of alternative ways to thinking about the problem like the first one. But I imagine for those of you who started out wanting to think about the electric field, you'll recognize the easiest tool to get to where you need to be more and more as you round out the semester. Problem 2, a capacitor with a dielectric. For the most part, people did, sort of how I would expect that. One part of that problem I knew ahead of time would be the most tricky one, was the last part. I think it was only worth a couple of points. But it had to do with figuring out how much charge was induced on the dielectric surfaces. And the reason I knew that would be more challenging is because there's a formula that we worked through and derived in class that has to do with relating the free charge density versus the induced charge density, which I did not put on the formula sheet intentionally. The reason for that is I kind of wanted you to be able to figure it out by just thinking about how the electric field, if you will, and the electric field from the induced charge on the dielectric played off against one another. And so some of you I know won't have got that last bit. I'm not too worried about that. Again, I knew it would be pushing you a little bit, and it's a small thing, okay? But a lot of you got it nevertheless, so I'm pretty happy about that. So the one big surprise for me came in the third problem with a multi-capacitor circuit. A number of you had found this really quite tough. And it may have been sort of amplified a little bit by the fact that there are 2 parts to the problem with a different configuration. And the second part in particular, where you have 2 switches, both of which are closed at that point, may have just kind of been sufficiently involved that it threw some people. So I don't necessarily have any great advice here other than to say, those of you who struggle with this, it may seem a little easier now that we've actually done similar analyses for multiple resistor circuits. And in that sense, I think we're getting better practice at understanding what's in series and what's in parallel. But I think the more important thing with that problem is to always keep in mind what's common for capacitors in series versus capacitors in parallel. For any sort of elements in circuits, be they capacitors or resistors, if they're in parallel, the thing to keep in mind is you're always going to have the same potential difference across those things that are in parallel. And then for the capacitors in series, you know that you're always going to have the same charge on the plates of capacitors that are in series. And as we look forward to resistors, which of course were not part of this test, what you see as common there is that you have the same current through resistors in series. So a fair number of you were thrown, I think, by those guiding principles for multi-capacitor circuits. Obviously, I want you, if you have trouble with that problem, I want you to go back, rework it, ideally rework it without looking at the solution when you've got a little bit more of a relaxed environment. And then, of course, look at the solution as needed, and as always, if you have questions, come and talk to me. Okay. So in that sense, I think problem 3 was the one that was a little bit different than I expected. Okay, so just last thing formally there, as always, the regrade request option. If you want to exercise that, the solutions are up on Courseworks. There's a regrade request form. Please submit that by the end of the day next Thursday if you want to submit a regrade request. Now, you see I haven't yet put approximate letter grades on here. We had some debate about that after the first midterm, and you know why I didn't do it at that point. I will do it on here because this is more like a distribution that I'm expecting for the course overall and for the final. A couple of people have asked me in office hour this week already, what should you expect in terms of the final versus the 2 midterms? In terms of, let me say, challenge level, closer to this. It probably will be very similar to this in sort of level of problem. Okay. So let me stop and ask for comments and questions. Yeah, so a little louder.
How would the real grade reflect what we had when we played down the distribution? Or do you not have an answer to that question? I don't know if you
I don't think I I talked at length about the overall grade distribution that I expect of the course. The median letter grade is going to be somewhere in the middle of the B+ range, and this is sort of a typical distribution, albeit it's a little wider than usual. And the only comment I'll remind you of after the first midterm, because it's an easy midterm, a lot of people do very well, is not to get wedded to the idea of whatever curve you guys are used to from wherever you were before Columbia. So don't get wedded to that, just get wedded to the overall distribution. And of course, when there's a high scoring contribution like the first midterm, most of you that just raises the entire distribution up, and it's still curved according to the prescription that the median grade is going to be somewhere in the middle of the B+. Elizabeth?
When you say the median grade, you mean the median grade on each individual exam or the median grade overall?
Overall, okay. So for those of you who are in 1601, which is most of you, we talked at length about this at that point as well. So it is the overall distribution. Keep that in mind. Okay. Other comments, questions? Okay. And again, for those of you who want to figure out how to improve your strategy, now please go ahead with that. Other thing I wanted to ask you to help on this morning is for your feedback. This is only a little bit to help you for the remaining month of the course, but it's actually more to help your future students who will be taking this course next year, 1601, 1602. And in particular, we're trying to figure out in the department how to make the best use of recitations. So they may modify a little bit in format and possibly even in length next semester for the students who are taking this sequence next year. So what I'm going to ask you to do, I don't like to distract you from class, but I welcome this input by the end of today, is I'd like you to grab an index card. I'm just going to pass them out. Just grab one and distribute them as best you can. I'd like you to think back over the recitation experience, not just this semester, but also the first semester, for those of you who took the first semester, 1601. And not a particularly structured set of questions that I have, but I'd like to have you tell me what you think about the possibility of having recitations that are not 50 minutes, but 80 minutes, an hour and 20 minutes each week. And I'd like you to think about how your particular recitation sections have been structured. We've been trying various combinations of having them do small group work on new problems that we don't give you ahead of time. There's a reason for that. I'd like your feedback on that. I'd also like your feedback on the extent to which you feel you've got enough guidance related to homework problems and recitation. If you would want more, tell me that. And also, to some extent, but this is a little bit hard for us to control, the timing of recitations compared to particular homework submission times, dates. The reason for all of this is we're trying to move in the department towards a much more active style of learning in recitation. Large lecture halls like this are not particularly amenable to that, but as I think you're all learning now, one of the best ways to master this material is to work on it with groups of 2 or 3 of your peers. So we want to do more of that. We want to encourage you to do more of it, and the recitations are the venue for that. So again, whatever suggestions you have, please write them down, anonymous. Hand them in at the end of class. We're going to review these and decide what, if any, changes we make to the recitations for this sequence next year. Yeah, I guess that's it. All right. So with that, let's turn our attention back to magnetism. So I'm going to leave that up left. All right, so what I'm hoping to cover today, just wrapping up a little bit on magnetic fields associated with current carrying loops. We obviously wrapped up with that on Tuesday. And then we're going to transition for the rest of the morning to figure out how we can calculate magnetic fields associated initially with moving charges, and then going from individual charges to more macroscopic currents. So let me just set the big picture here. We're kind of repeating the type of progression we did with electrostatics. We're going to be figuring out today magnetic fields from certain very specific charge or current configurations by integration, the same way we did for electric fields and subsequently for electric potentials or static charge distributions. Then we're going to turn our attention at this point, just like this thing on Tuesday, to a competing or complementary tool to allow us to figure out B fields. In some ways, I would say as a tool or as a purpose, it's analogous to Gauss's law to figure out electric fields from somewhat complicated charge distributions. We'll introduce the analogous sort of tool for figuring out magnetic fields from maybe more complicated current distributions. And at that point, we've kind of done a lot of the same stuff we were doing for electrostatics. We'll take a little bit of a diversion to start showing more of the connections between electricity and magnetism, and when there are changes in these things, what sort of phenomena they induce. And then we're going to go back a little bit, the same way we did in electrostatics, to look at how these concepts apply to practical devices in circuits. Okay? So the roadmap is very similar. There are obviously some differences along the way, but I'm hoping the similarities kind of help reinforce some of these ideas, albeit processes associated with them. And then we'll integrate everything together in electromagnetism. So that's the big picture. All right, so let me just remind you of where we wrapped up. By good fortune, the diagram from Tuesday's class is still on the chalkboard in the middle here. To remind you of the geometry that we were looking at, this is a rectangular current carrying loop embedded in a uniform external B field. And what we determined after a little bit of work is that there indeed is a torque on this object, and the magnitude of the torque is given by this expression over here. Okay? We talked a little bit about how the torque varies depending on orientation. I'm quickly going to remind you of that. And then I'm going to turn your attention to how we can maybe think about this torque as, in fact, a magnetic dipole. So, this is where we ended up on Tuesday. This is the magnitude of the torque. We learned it depends on the current, the cross-sectional area, the external magnetic field, and the crucial dependence on the relative orientation angle of the loop with respect to the external field. Now, we introduced the idea that such a device would be the basis for a motor, and of course it is. Once we add this little kind of variation in how we drive the current through the circuit to make sure it rotates in the same direction all of the time. So we know of some ways to increase, let's say, the usefulness of our motor. If we want a powerful motor, we need a large torque, so we can increase these quantities here to do just that. There's one other simple way we can introduce a new variable, a new variant, to further increase, let's say, the torque and therefore the power of this motor. And it's a simple thing to do in that sort of little mock-up, not so little mock-up that you saw on Tuesday. I had a single loop of wire carrying current. But of course what I could do is take that current carrying wire and actually make it a multi-loop circuit. And of course it's just a single wire, so if I wrap it around many times, basically what I'm doing is multiplying the current by however many wraps I have around this. So we can sometimes, and we often will, multiply the effect by having the wire wrap around n times. And no big surprise, the torque just gets amplified by that factor. Okay, so this is an easy way to get more bang for the buck if you want to produce a powerful motor. Just make sure that your coil has many, many loops of current in it. So that's a very common thing to do. All right. So we learned that. The other things that we learned about, just as a reminder, is the following. So the torque is greatest for theta equal to 90 degrees. And remember our angle definition here. It's still there. It's the angle between the normal vector to the plane in which the loop finds itself and the external B field. Okay, so you always want to remember how theta is defined for these problems. It's the angle between the perpendicular to the loop and the B field. Again, this usually requires a little bit of thinking to convince yourself it's so, but it is. So this is greatest for theta being 90 degrees, and it is 0 or theta is either 0 degrees or 180 degrees. Okay? So, you remember when we talked about an electric dipole oriented in an external electric field, we had a very similar setup, which I'm going to reinforce in just a moment, by looking specifically at a magnetic dipole. But what we learned is we have an electric dipole in an external E field. We can also figure out the torque on that. And we learned something very similar. And in particular, we learned that there are so-called stable equilibrium positions versus unstable equilibrium positions. So a reminder what that means. If we have an unstable equilibrium orientation, if we deviate slightly from that alignment, the torque is going to turn it around. It's going to flip the dipole. That's what we call an unstable equilibrium. Conversely, if I'm 180 degrees in the other direction, and I disturb it a little bit from that equilibrium position, the torque is going to tend to turn it back to that equilibrium position. That's what we will call a stable equilibrium. Okay? So it's an exactly analogous situation. This is the stable one, and this is the unstable one. Okay? Now again, I'm guessing this might be required to just visually or mentally work through this a little bit to convince yourself it's true, but it is. Okay? All right. So let me take this idea a little bit further and introduce the idea of a magnetic dipole and a magnetic dipole moment. So if you think about this, we've got this loop. It's a current carrying loop, and it, in a sense, wants to be in a certain orientation. If you think about how the torque acts on this. So it wants to be in one of these orientations, and the stable equilibrium point is going to be the lowest energy orientation of this coil with respect to the external E field. So what we're going to do now, and again there's going to be clear analogies with what we did for electric dipoles, is specifically introduce the concept of a magnetic dipole moment. And you'll see me write up a couple of reminders of what we did for the electric dipole in just a moment. So we're going to define a magnetic dipole moment, MDM, magnetic dipole moment, in the direction of that normal vector, which I hope is still up on there. Okay, notice there actually is a true vector as opposed to a unit vector, but the direction of course is the same. So we're going to define a magnetic dipole moment in that perpendicular direction. We're going to define it in the following way. It's simply the product of, I'm going to forget this for a moment, it's the product of the current going around the loop and the cross-sectional area of the loop. Okay? So IA for a single loop current. But as we just learned, it's very often the case that we're going to have the loop wrap around big N times, in which case the magnetic dipole moment is multiplied by big N. Okay? So this is not always there, but if we have more than one loop, it is. Okay, so just think of it as I times A with a possible multiplier. Here's the symbol we're going to use. So for electric dipole moment, we had P. And so we're defining now the magnitude of this magnetic dipole moment as this quantity. All right. So if I take this and just feed it back into here, this tells me that I can write the torque now explicitly in terms of this as mu p sine theta. And if I want to put this in vector product notation, I'm going to write it like this. Okay, so now we've got mu defined like so. The angle theta is the angle between the normal vector and the external magnetic field. And as always, when I've got something that looks like a sine theta here, I can embed it in the vector product. And then we have the complication of figuring out with our right-hand rule what the relative torque direction is given these parameters, okay? So I know this takes a little bit of care, making sure we get all the directionality right, but it works, okay? Now let me just remind you what we had for an external E field with an electric dipole in it. In that case, we had an expression which looks like this, okay? So you see we're seeing some nice parallelism here. This is the vector product of the electric dipole moment. Just to remind you what that was, it's just the product of the charge on the dipole and the separation between the charges. This was just QD. And now we have this with the vector product of the electric field, okay? So, in a sense, you can imagine any current carrying loop will often make them circular. This will have relevance on the atomic scale quite often, because of course in certain simplifications we can imagine atoms with electrons moving around in circular orbits around an atomic nucleus. So that becomes essentially the analog of a current carrying loop, an electron rotating, let's say, in a circular path around its parent nucleus. And so this is going to produce a tendency to want to orient in a certain direction with respect to an external magnetic field. So let's say here's the plane. My normal vector to the plane is this. And then again, if I'm in some external magnetic field, there's going to be a preference for this spinning charge. It could be an atom to orient in a certain direction with respect to that external E field. Somebody on Tuesday, when we were talking about magnetic field strengths, mentioned MRI technology, magnetic resonance imaging technology, very much relevant to this. We're not going to have time, unfortunately, to talk about it in class, but I have no doubt it's referred to in the textbook. So if you want to learn a little bit more about magnetic resonance imaging, now is a good time to do so. Okay? All right, the other thing that we introduced when we went back to this was the idea of energy associated with the alignment of this electric dipole in the external E field. And I will remind you, I apologize, this is not the most sensible use of real estate on the chalkboard, but what we arrived at in the case of the electric dipole in an external E field is that we could designate an associated potential energy, which is just happens. A convenient way to define it is the scalar product of P dot E. So of course the angular dependence is embedded in here. And this is set up in such a way as with any potential energy definition, we can set the 0 point wherever we want. Okay? And this is set up in such a way so that the 0 point in this case is where P is perpendicular to E. That's when U equals 0. And then we have a negative relative potential energy when they're aligned, which is the lowest energy state, the stable equilibrium. And we have a positive potential energy when it's anti-aligned. Okay? So this is a throwback to 3 or 4 weeks ago. I'm not going to dwell on this because it's absolutely the same thing, but we can associate, in this case, a potential energy which has the exact same format. Okay? So nice symmetry here. And again, it has this particular choice of 0, so that zeros when we are, let's see if I can get this right now, so when the normal vector is perpendicular to the B field, and then we have a lower energy state when the normal vector is parallel to the B field, and a higher energy state when the normal vector is anti-parallel to the B field. So I know that's a lot, and it's a lot in particular. I'm asking you to think back to what we did a few weeks back, but hopefully you can at least see the absolute similarity here. And I'd recommend you just spend 5 minutes after class just going through this on your own, making sure you understand the energy changes with different orientations. Okay, any questions? So let me just show you one demonstration, which is really a follow-on from this. We could have done it on Tuesday, but I'm going to show you now. So current carrying loop here, now you see if I turn it, it's a multi-loop coil. Just current coming in here, going out here, but it's wrapped around n times, so we're amplifying the effect. Suspended by the 2 wires that are carrying the current into it, a narrow one just for visual excitement, between the poles of a permanent bar magnet. So B field horizontally, current vertically here, and these things always take a bit of time to extrapolate this onto the geometry up here. But if I flow current through this, I should expect it to rotate, okay? Now the reason I want to show you this in this particular geometry is to illustrate a little bit more how the galvanometers, the basis of the ammeters and the voltmeters we talked about